All right, let's begin. So if you didn't already pick up your graded homework assignment, you can grab that off of the back table at the end of class. And then homework 15, depreciation, that's your final assignment of the semester. That's due on Monday. And then on Friday of next week, we're going to have the bonus quiz, which is that multiple choice concept inventory to try and see if you have improved your score over the course of the semester. So definitely show up for that, and then also show up for the final exam. I'm going to talk more about the final exam next week, but what we'll do at the beginning of each of the next few class periods is we'll identify some concepts just to start seeding your mind with the ideas that you may want to review as you prepare for the final. So our final exam is scheduled on the last day, December 16th. That's the last day of finals at 10:15. So at least it's not the last time slot, but it is the last day. Any questions related to the announcements before we begin? All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to be focusing on some of the concepts from way back that may have drifted out of your mind. And so one of those is when we were talking about cash flow diagrams. And remember that anytime we're doing engineering economy, we're trying to choose among alternatives, trying to pick which choice is best. And oftentimes, among our alternatives, they last for a different number of years. They have different useful lives. And sometimes we can get over that by invoking what we call the repeatability assumption. And so if I asked you to briefly explain the repeatability assumption, what I would hope you would remember is that when you're using the repeatability assumption, you're trying to repeat both the costs and also the revenues for an item over a certain number of periods so that two alternatives terminate at the same number of years. And so just as a point of example, let's say you have one option that lasts for 2 years. Maybe it's a piece of equipment. It lasts for 2 years, and another option that lasts for 6. And so what you would do is you'd repeat the 2-year cash flow diagram cycle 3 times so that it terminates in the 6th year, but you wouldn't need to repeat the 6-year cash flow diagram at all. The thing that is the common mistake when it comes to the repeatability assumption is sometimes students forget that the purchase of the item, the repurchase of the item, has to occur in the same year that you're getting revenue. And so, for example, that 2-year cycle, you'd need to buy the item at the end of the 2nd year, and that's at the same time that you're getting the revenue for operating during the 2nd year. So you have to make sure that you have the times lined up. Any questions about the repeatability assumption? All right, so here's one for you. We talked about sometimes the repeatability assumption doesn't apply. Maybe the equipment's going to get more expensive over time, or maybe we're buying a unique item that just there isn't a ready market of, and so we can't count on the fact of being able to buy the same thing in the future. So we don't want to necessarily extend our cash flow cycles over and over again, but we have other tools of dealing with that. So who can mention one of the other tools that we've got to compare different items with different useful lives if we're not using the repeatability assumption? Yes? Well, you're headed on the right track. I mean, we definitely will want to use present worth analysis in comparing both of the options. I mean, remember, when we're comparing the options, we have to either take everything to the present, or we have to take everything to some future year, or we have to take it to an annual series. But when we do the annual series approach, it sort of implies the repeatability assumption. So in a case where repeatability doesn't apply, let's say we have one option that lasts for, so we buy the item and we get revenue for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so this is option A. And then option B lasts for longer. It costs more up front, but then we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of it. Okay, now we can't do repeatability. So what do we do to compare option A and option B, one of our methods, if option B lasts longer than option A? So you were talking, like continue on what your point was.
Well, say year 6 and 7.
All right. Okay, so what he's saying is you've got this revenue coming to you in year 6 and 7, like the item isn't worn out yet. And so we can do something with that revenue in year 5. You're on the right track for sure. I think the idea that you've got is what we called early termination. That is, this revenue you would have got in year 6 or 7, you sell the item early. You sell it to someone else, and so that item still has some residual life in it. And so instead of getting the 2 years of revenue, you'd have a salvage value in year 5. So converting the 6 and the 7 to a salvage value, you're not actually manually making that conversion with a calculation. All you're doing is you're looking up in year 5 how much is a 5-year-old item of this nature likely to be worth. All right, so that was one of the approaches. What's the other way of comparing two cash flow diagrams when the number of useful, the number of years of useful life is different? One was early termination. What was another? Oh boy, I'm glad we're doing this review. No, we're going to have to let somebody else do it. What was it? Contract services, right. So explain contract services. What's the approach there? Exactly. So we take the short one, and we know that we need the equipment for the same number of years, and so we would pay something. We'd go to the equipment rental place, and we would pay to rent the item, and then we would get the revenue that we've always been getting, assuming that it's an interchangeable substitute. All right. So in short, early termination and contract services. Any questions about that? All right, this is going back into the archives here. What's the main advantage of the external rate of return method compared to the internal rate of return method? Yes? So what's the advantage of one method compared to another? All right. So he's pointing out an important factor, and that is the internal rate of return has an assumption built into it. And it's assuming that all the revenue you generate stays in the same project. And so remember, we've talked about how savings accounts are an illustration of some sort of an investment where that's fine, because whatever the bank pays you, you can leave in the account, and that interest will earn more interest on top of itself. But then other projects don't necessarily have that reinvestment option available. So that's an important thing. But the advantage of the external rate of return method, the critical thing in this question is why is ERR better? And the reason why is you can't compare projects on the basis of internal rate of return. That was the other big warning that I gave you lots of times, is that the project with the highest internal rate of return isn't necessarily the best project. You can know what's the best project by doing present worth analysis, and sometimes, coincidentally, the project with the best internal rate of return is the best project, but the external rate of return, you can sort of rank alternatives on that basis in a way that isn't available to you when you're doing internal rate of return. So I'd hope that you'd identify that weakness of the internal rate of return method, is that it's the basis for applying IRR is you compare IRR to MAR for a yes-no, but you do not compare different alternatives on the basis of IRR. It's strictly just a viable or not viable screening tool. All right? Great question, yes. So his question is about the incremental internal rate of return, and you can use that. So the incremental internal rate of return is saying, you know, if one item costs more than another, you look at the additional costs and the additional revenues that it's going to generate, and so that if you have an incremental internal rate of return greater than the MAR, then that tells you that the more expensive alternative is justified. And so you could compare alternatives if you do the incremental analysis. All right, here's one that everybody, I hope by now, should be able to write a really home run short answer on this question. So how about on this side of the room? Anybody explain why money now is more valuable than money in the future? Jared?
Because of inflation.
Because of inflation. Expand. Expand on that.
So as time goes on, inflation is going to increase, and then the value of money is just going to decrease because of that.
So he's saying inflation is going to increase over time and the value of money is going to decrease. So let me play the devil's advocate here, or maybe like the uninformed person. So doesn't inflation just mean there's going to be more money in the future? So if there's more money, that's better, right?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
Because if there's more money, then there's less demand of it.
Okay, what's inflating when we talk about inflation? Prices are inflating, right? So if someone says, I'll give you $100 now or $100 in 5 years, the $100 now is more valuable because you can buy more stuff with it. In the future, prices will have inflated, and so that same amount of money will be worth less. All right. Lastly, identify a shortcoming with the B2C method. B2C is, remember, where we're comparing benefits and costs. And there's a lot of weaknesses of this method. We only use it as kind of a last resort in projects that we'd have no other tool for comparison, because we apply it for public projects that, by and large, are going to be losing money. And so we can't calculate rates of return on a project that, by its very conception, is supposed to be losing money, you know, like a road or a sewer network or a public park for children. Those projects aren't going to be turning a profit. And so we have to have some other method. B2C method has plenty of weaknesses. And so can anybody think of one? Andrew, any ideas? Okay, you're trying to put a number on benefits. You're right. So elaborate what you mean. Why is that a weakness? All right. So he says what you may think of as worth is different for someone else. And so this is highly subjective. You know, to the kid playing in the park, a public park is worth a lot. To the grumpy old man who never goes to the park is worth nothing, and he wants his taxes to go down. So this is a subjective thing that it's really hard to quantify a lot of the things that go into the benefits. The costs are easier to quantify, but besides benefits, what's another thing that's even more difficult to quantify than the benefits? Disbenefits. And why are disbenefits even more difficult to quantify? It's because, for one thing, it's subjective, but then for another, you're predicting into the future what's going to happen. So if you're shutting down a road for repaving, you're having to guess how long the road will be shut down, and like if there's a business owner that's going to have his business impacted by the road being closed, and how many of his customers are going to walk to the business instead of they used to drive and park in the parking lot. It's really hard to estimate what the future negative consequences of a project are going to be. And so this method is subjective. You're trying to make these subjective projections into the future, and so it's better than nothing, but it has plenty of concerns. All right, so any questions related to these concepts before we move into talking about taxes today? I'd really encourage you to flip through your notes. You know, a little bit each day is going to be better than trying to cram the night before. If you just sort of refresh your mind, then that's a more effective study habit. All right. So we're talking about taxes today. And some taxes are only collected once a year. So an example of that is property taxes. I go into the Cabell County courthouse, you know, the county complex where they've got the courts and the clerk. I go in there I think it's every August, and pay my property tax. I write a check, I give it to them, so it's a once-a-year thing. But sales taxes are collected every time you buy an item, including online now. Do you remember the good old days when you didn't have to pay taxes on purchases from Amazon? I mean, you were supposed to, right? That was something you were supposed to say that you made purchases online, but I don't think anybody did, really. Now, Amazon is collecting the sales tax, and they pass that along to the state. But here on the receipt, you can see that it's identifying the sales tax, and it looks like they have a couple of different classifications here. This is basically a well-balanced breakfast. You can see someone's bought Pepsi and Pop-Tarts, some Arbor Mist and Coke. So whoever, I just found this online, but somebody's got a great evening planned with this receipt. But most sales tax receipts, if you look at a Walmart receipt from this area, some of the items will be subject to a 6% tax, and that's usually like clothing and TVs and just regular merchandise, but food is exempt from tax. It's a little bit odd the way that tax is collected in the United States and Canada, where it's not built into the item price itself. You know, in most countries, when you go to the store, it says on the shelf €1, then you have to pay €1, and you're not fumbling for pennies at the end of it. They actually display the price that's inclusive of taxes. Similar to, like, if you go to a baseball game and you buy a hot dog, you give the guy $7, and you don't have to give him like a bunch of pennies too, because in rare instances they'll allow you to build the price of tax into the item, but for whatever reason, by local regulation, that's normally not permitted. So here's an example of a Swiss receipt where these items have the taxes built right in, but then at the bottom of the receipt they tell you of the $54.50 how much of that was taxes. And in whatever canton of Switzerland this is, the tax was 7.6%. And so they say it's $3.85. So sales tax is something that we see pretty often. And here's an interesting figure that compares states on the basis of the sales tax that they collect. And the highest sales taxes in the country are in California. That's no surprise, right? We've all heard that California, they do things strange out there. They like high taxes and, I don't know, I guess sunshine. But right next door to California, in Oregon, there's no sales tax there. And so all the money that's being collected on the basis of sales tax has to just be collected a different way in Oregon. It's not like people in Oregon are paying drastically less taxes than people in California. It's just they're paying it in a different way. So here in West Virginia, it's 6%. Except for there are a few localities that also have a local sales tax added on. Here in Huntington is one of them. There's a 1% tax in Huntington. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's cheaper to buy things at the Barboursville Walmart than it is to buy it at the Huntington Walmart, because the Huntington Walmart collects that 1% tax and the Barboursville doesn't. I may be mistaken about that, but I do know that Huntington has a 1% tax, and there are, I think, about 20 cities across the state of West Virginia that have a local sales tax as well. Here's another kind of tax, another category of tax that's called an excise tax. An excise tax is a tax that's applied on a specific category of item. And so sales taxes more or less apply to everything. There may be a classification, like a food category that's exempt, but you pay the same tax for pants as you do for a new trail camera. You know, the sales tax rate is the same. It's just simpler that way. But there are a few categories of items where there's a special tax on top of it. And so this is comparing the gasoline taxes. And this is as of 2010, and it may have changed a little bit, but actually I don't think that it has, because a lot of people are saying that gas taxes should go up. Now, while the prices are low, we wouldn't mind so much. And for many, many years, they haven't been collecting enough in fuel taxes to pay for proper upkeep of the roads. Like you may have noticed, that road conditions seem to be getting worse and worse each year, and it becomes harder and harder for the Division of Highways to maintain the roads because their budget isn't expanding, and the majority of highway construction and maintenance is funded by this gasoline tax. So here in West Virginia, we pay 32 cents per gallon. Ohio's a little bit less, 28. But consider how inexpensive it is. Let's see, I was looking earlier, and I think I remember that Wyoming, Alaska, 8 cents per gallon in Alaska, compared to 46 cents per gallon in California. So it's a big difference. And I guess maybe in Alaska they're able to do that because what big revenue source do they have in Alaska? Do you know? They've got oil. Yeah, so the state gets royalties from oil companies in Alaska, and actually Alaska doesn't charge income tax to its residents. It has an annual dividend. And so instead of paying income tax, people in Alaska actually get a check each year. And a few years ago, it was up over $2,000, which wouldn't be too bad, right? To get a couple $1,000s at the end of the year just for living in Alaska. Well, now actually that sounds pretty terrible. They've got a long winter up there, so I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't be worth it. But it's interesting to look at the geographic variation. And what we're going to do today in class as part of the in-class exercise is calculate what should our gas tax be. You know, people are really sensitive to taxes, and politicians who campaign on the promise of raising taxes, they very rarely get elected. I mean, the politicians who raise taxes kind of have to do it secretly, or they have to pretend like they had no option. But it seems like not only locally, but just as a nationwide trend, taxes have been going down. And so we're going to calculate how much the taxes ought to be on gasoline and see how that compares on a per gallon basis. And so the main thing to remember about gasoline tax is it's a category called excise. Here's another kind of excise tax on cigarettes. Now, West Virginia has one of the lower cigarette taxes at 55 cents per pack. And this was as of 2014. I think it's possible that the cigarette tax went up in the last legislative session. That's maybe one of the ways they were trying to make up the deficit that they had. But it didn't go up a lot. Not as much as, say, they pay in New York. In New York, each pack of cigarettes has a tax of $4.35, right? And that's, in New York City, they have another tax on top of it. So that's the state tax. And on top of that state tax is a city tax, I think of $2 or $3 a pack. And so a pack of cigarettes in New York City is like $9 or $10. And I think here in the area, it's what, around $4 I've seen as I drive around. I don't buy them, but I've seen it at gas stations and stuff. $4? $6.50? Well, you're buying the good cigarettes then, right? You got to switch to something cheaper. All right. Or go somewhere they've got cheap cigarettes, like Georgia has low taxes. Why is it that in the South we have lower cigarette taxes than in other places? Any thoughts about that? More people smoke, so they just won't stand for it, right? Okay, so maybe if more people are smoking, they're getting the income from it, so they don't need to have it as high, yeah? Excellent. Yeah, so the South is where tobacco is grown, and so if it's viewed as sort of a home industry, then legislatures are more likely to be going easy on it. They don't want to tax it too much. Whereas Washington, Minnesota, New York, tobacco doesn't grow that far north, at least not well. So It's interesting to compare these differences from state to state. So here's some terminology that you need to be acquainted with. Property taxes are collected on the value of equipment and land. And we've been talking about property taxes already a little bit because we've been discussing depreciation. And depreciation most of the time is actually used as a deduction against income. But there is a relationship between depreciation and property taxes because over time property becomes less valuable and you pay less in tax on it. And here in Cabell County, we have to pay property taxes both on real property, meaning your house and your land, but also you have to pay property taxes on your car. You have to pay property taxes on your dog, believe it or not. On your annual property tax return, they charge on a dog. And there's also a line on there to list how many goats you own. And they collect property tax money based on how many goats you own. And so far I've avoided that tax. But I guess it's only a matter of time. So taxes, property taxes are independent of what you're doing with the output of property, with an exception. And that is that sometimes property that's being used to produce rental income is taxed at a different rate than owner-occupied property. And in fact, that's the case in most of the jurisdictions in Cabell County. That, for instance, if you've got a rental house in Huntington, if you're renting it out to college students, you have to pay more in property taxes for the house that you've rented out to other people than if you're living in it yourself. And in fact, it's about double. That's another thing that you'll calculate in the in-class exercise today is the tax implications of rental property. Okay, we've talked about excise taxes, and those are based on specific goods or services, and they're usually considered non-necessities, or we want to collect the separate amount because we're going to do something different with it. And so gas taxes are collected separately because in theory the majority of that money is supposed to go into maintaining roads. A little bit of it goes into research on transportation issues. So in the cases of alcohol excise taxes and cigarette excise taxes, oftentimes state governments will use that money to fund health and education programs. All right, sales taxes are based on the final purchase price of an item. And sales taxes are a little bit different from value-added taxes. Who here has heard of a value-added tax? Anyone? Yeah? Okay. Value-added tax is what they do in Canada and most of Europe, and it's similar to a sales tax, except for in a value-added tax, every step of the way the tax is added, instead of just the end purchase. And so, for example, if you go to Walmart and you buy a trail camera, then the only time tax gets collected for that item being produced and sold is when you pay it to the store and the store turns it over. But a value-added tax, what would happen is that the person who imports the plastic has to pay a tax when they sell it to whoever manufactures the case. And then whoever takes the case and sells it to Bushnell, that transaction is taxed. And then when Bushnell sells it to Dick's, then that transaction is taxed. And so every step in the process, there's a small tax applied, and the value added, the phrase value added is just any time you do something to an item to add value, whether you are melting a raw pellet of plastic and shaping it into something useful, or you're taking it from a distributor and putting it into a retail environment, each one of those transactions is taxed in a value-added tax. And believe it or not, they say that there's less cheating in systems that use value-added taxes because the end user isn't given all of the burden for paying the tax on an item. So that's something that a lot of people have talked about starting in the United States, but it seems unlikely to be adopted just because of resistance to taxes here. Income tax we'll talk in more detail when we get together on Monday. All right, so here is the in-class exercise that I have for you today. What we're going to be doing is, like I said before, we're going to be focusing on the gas tax, which is an example of an excise tax, and then on the property tax. Now, unfortunately, it's kind of a strange thing, but the Cabell County assessor, who is in charge of telling you how much property tax you have to pay, there's some sort of a weird state regulation that means the tax forms aren't available online except for a couple of months each year. I wish I had downloaded the tax form earlier in the semester, but it's not available now because I wanted to show you where you have to tell them how many goats you've got. It's kind of a funny form to fill out every year, but we'll look at it a different way. In the first part, for the excise tax, I've given you a link where I'd like you to look up online using your computer or phone, look up how much the state of West Virginia spent on transportation during the last fiscal year. That's available on a budget website for the state of West Virginia. So look up how much they spent on highways for all the sources of revenue. You'll notice when you look at that most of the revenue they got was from the gas tax, but they do have some of the revenue that goes into transportation from the general fund and other categories. So I looked up online that there are 700,000 vehicles in the state, and if we were going to collect that amount on the basis of per vehicle, how much would we need to collect? Like if it was just, if the highway tax was collected when you registered your car, how much would that tax need to be? And then the other way of looking at it is on the basis of gasoline consumption. So I looked up the population of the state and also the per capita gasoline usage. And so from those two figures, the population and per capita gasoline usage, you can find out how many gallons are consumed. And from the first part, you're going to know the total amount of money that has to be collected. Okay, so let's talk about the excise tax after you've had a chance to go through these calculations. A word of caution when you do find that spreadsheet that I've mentioned is that these amounts are in thousands. Thousands. And so you need to multiply any amount you see by 1,000 to get the actual dollar amount. Okay, so off of that first spreadsheet summary we were looking at, it looks like in West Virginia they spent about $1.3 billion on the roads during fiscal year 2016. Although you wouldn't know that if you drove down Blue Sulphur Road, which is where I live. That place, I've been to some pretty bad places in the world, you know, like India, Africa, Nepal, and they all had better roads than that one. All right, so $1.2 billion in 2016. So if we were going to spread that out over 700,000 vehicles, then that means you'd have to collect $1,800 per year from each vehicle. And that would really be a lot because right now you're paying the registration fee, I think, is only $30. And then you have to pay your county tax on it, which is, between $100 to $300 a car, unless you have one of these really expensive, like $80,000 trucks or something. But it's just a couple $100. But if you added on another $1,800 per vehicle as a all-at-once kind of tax, then that would be pretty difficult for some people to pay. So it's a lot easier just to collect it per gallon. And another argument in favor of collecting it per gallon is that people who use the roads more are going to pay more. And so if you burn a lot of gasoline, maybe you're using more of the roads, you're doing more wear and tear, and so you should pay a larger proportion of the overall cost. So if we were going to collect that much revenue, 1.2 billion, on the basis of 844 million gallons of gasoline, then what we should be collecting is $1.49 in taxes per gallon. What we are collecting in fuel tax is a lot less than that. The gasoline tax rate, 32 cents per gallon. So that's kind of why the state is always struggling to keep the roads in good condition, is that people don't want to pay for the upkeep of the roads. And so what ends up happening is the federal government pays some of that amount. You know, it's not just the state tax that supports the road. There's a federal fuel tax as well in addition to the state fuel tax. And then there's just general funds that have to be used to make up the difference. But it's kind of interesting to look at the difference between maybe what we'd consider normal and what is being collected for the upkeep of those roads. All right, so in the second part, you're to look at the property tax situation. And let me, in case you don't have a phone with you, I'll pull up that link for the Cabell County Assessor. It's a bummer if we go to the forms that they have this weird, you can't get the actual property tax form due to state code. I even tried to find a cached version of that PDF and I couldn't find it. So anyways, so here is the tax rates for different parts of the county: Huntington, rural areas, Barbersville, and Milton. So those are the 4 different possibilities. And then these different classes are levied on the basis of whether it's owner-occupied or occupied by renters. So Barbersville has the highest taxes, the highest property taxes in the county. And I'll give you a few minutes to consider the questions on the back side of that form. Be aware that there's a difference between appraised value and assessed value. They give you a little example here, and the assessed value is 60% of the appraised value, and the value that I've mentioned of $200,000, that's an appraised value. So your first thing that you're going to need to do is calculate what is the assessed value. The answers for this one: if your home is in a rural area, the assessed value is going to be $120,000. Well, regardless of where it is, that's the assessed value. And then the property tax that's due will be $1,648.32. Anybody else get that same amount? Yep. Okay, so if you're in Huntington where the tax rates are higher, then I think the tax would be $4,064.64. And then the breakdown of where the taxes go, only a small fraction will end up at the libraries. They'll get $51.62. And that's just based on the percentages that were listed in this table. All right, so we'll continue talking about taxes when we get together on Monday. If you didn't already get your homework assignment, please grab that on your way out, and have a great weekend.